Hi everybody, this is Laura, City Scrapper. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the June My Creative Scrapbook Limited Edition kit. I'm often asked about how I back a cut file, so I thought I would include a little bit of that process in this video. I'm using a pear tree cut file. This is one of the many cut files that are available to My Creative Scrapbook subscribers. And in the limited edition kit this month, we received a number of papers from the 49 and Mark It Everywhere collection. To cut out letters that are the right size for the cut file, I flip over the cut file and I flip over the pattern paper and I use a pencil and I trace around the inside of the letter on the cut file, and then I cut slightly outside of that line to cut a paper that will fit behind the cut file. I did that for all the letters and for all of the arrows. Using my Silhouette Cameo, I cut out the cut file again. This time I don't cut the inner cuts, and I do that by selecting Release Compound Path, and I just pull out all of those lines that make the inner cuts. I once again cut out the cut file. I backed the whole cut file with some gel glue, put the backing on it, and I allow that to dry. That makes the whole cut file a little more sturdy, and it makes it easier for me to stitch on it. I'm using this little Amy Tangerine poking tool, and I'm poking holes approximately 1/4 of an inch apart, sometimes a little bit closer. You don't have to have that tool though. You could use a needle, you could use a thumbtack. Just make sure you put something underneath the cut file to protect whatever surface you're working on. I poked holes all around the inside of the cut file, and now I am using a very simple back stitch and some colored embroidery floss, and I'm stitching along those lines. I am using some matching orange thread. I'm also going to use some light blue thread and some dark blue thread. I think that this adds a lot of texture to the cut file. So that was a very quick summary of how I go about backing and stitching a cut file. Now I'm going to create the background for my layout. I use the outside of one of the sheets of pattern paper we got in the kit. I gutted that, I mounted on another piece of paper. Then I'm going to put a piece of white cardstock that's cut a little bit smaller behind it. And then on top of that, I'm going to attach this beautiful 49 and Mark It pattern paper. And that's the paper I'm going to have in the background that I'm going to layer my cut file on top of. I layered the pattern paper on top of the white paper a couple of times to get it to the right size. And then I inked the edges with some Distress Oxide in chipped sapphire. In case you'd like to know, the white paper is 11 7/16 inches square, and the pattern paper was trimmed down to 11 1/4 inches square. Even though there are a lot of layers of paper, I mounted that orange gutted piece of paper to a piece of 12 by 12 inch paper because I find sometimes that when I try to work with the gutted piece of paper without attaching it down to a larger sheet, it's a little bit difficult for me to manipulate. Sometimes it will buckle, and it's just easier for me to do it this way. So now I have quite a few sheets of paper making up this layout. Now I'm going to start working with my photo. I have a 4 by 6 inch photo. I trimmed it down from 6 inches to 5.5 inches, and then I left it 4 inches going from top to bottom. I mounted it on some white cardstock. I want to put another mat behind the photo, so I took a piece of white cardstock and I inked the edges with the Distress Oxide in chipped sapphire, and now I'm mounting my photo to that mat. I think that the dark blue mat will help it to pop off from the page. It'll give it a little bit of contrast from the background. So I have my photo in the upper right-hand corner. I'm going to layer my cut file on top of it, and the cut file will go pretty much in the center of the page. I'm using some ATG adhesive to attach it down. I will put some wet glue on it eventually, but I do not like to glue it down at this stage because I will often move cut files around as I add embellishments to the page. I do use my T-square to make sure that it is straight. Sometimes it could be a little bit crooked, and that could make a big difference in how the overall layout looks at the end. Once I am sure that the cut file is straight, I tuck my picture into the upper right-hand corner. I love the way the arrows are pointing at the photo. I only have one photo that I want to include on this page, but if I wanted to make it a two photo layout, there are several other spaces. One I'm thinking on the lower left-hand corner where another photo could be included, but there are a couple of places all around this cut file I could picture tucking another photo if you are someone who likes to have a lot of photos on your layouts. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It depends on the layout, it depends on the situation and the topic. I added some photo corners, something I love to do. I used an EK Success scalloped photo corner punch, and I punched out 4 photo corners and inked the edges again with the chipped sapphire. I'm using the 49 and Market flowers that were included in this month's kit. There was one very large blue flower, so I decided that I would remove some of the layers. I then took those layers and I added a smaller flower to the center. So now I have a large dark blue flower to include in each of my 3 clusters. I have included a light blue flower in the lower left-hand corner, and then I added some small flowers to the other 2 clusters and some leaves to the cluster with the large layered blue flower. I continue to build up those clusters by adding 1 small orange flower to each of the clusters. I'm going to make the cluster in the top left-hand side of the layout the smallest cluster. Then I'm going to make the one on the right-hand side the medium-sized cluster, and then the one on the bottom is going to be the largest cluster. I think it's important to point out that the flower clusters take me a little bit of time to arrange. Even though I might just be fiddling around with a couple of flowers, there's a certain look that the cluster will have when I see it, and I'll keep playing around with them till I see that look. It sometimes takes a little bit of time. Just the slightest change in the position of something can really make a difference in how the overall cluster looks. I just think it's important to point out that it takes a little bit of work. Those clusters don't come together always super easily. I use my Silhouette Cameo and I cut out the word awaits again. What I want to do is I want to add some texture to this word. I do this a lot with my cut files and any other areas on my layouts that are large flat areas of color. I don't necessarily want to add more different colors, but I like the idea of having some kind of variation or texture in any large areas that are flat, that are all the same color. So on this layout, I'm adding some modeling paste through a stencil that was in my stash. I looked for a stencil that had very small openings so that I could add a lot of texture on this small space. You could use any modeling paste. I like to use Liquitex modeling paste because the color is a very bright white. Some modeling pastes I've used in the past are a little more gray, although you can always add some white acrylic paint to modeling paste if it looks a little dull. With such small openings in the stencil, the modeling paste dries fairly quickly. I went back over the word again with another layer of modeling paste. And now that it's dry, I am attaching it down with some wet glue to the layout, and I do really like that addition of more texture. I'm going to add some leaves to the clusters. In order to create these leaves, I used some dies made by Sentimentally Yours. The name of this particular die is called Succulent Foliage. After cutting them out, I used some Distress Oxides to ink them. I used peeled paint, and then I used mowed lawn second to add a little bit of variation to the color. Just like with adding modeling paste to the cut file, I like to add variation, and I think you could do that with texture or you could do it with color. With the modeling paste, I added some texture, and now with the leaves, I added some different colors of green to add some variation in color. I think those little details make a big difference on the layout. I moved the cluster on the upper left-hand corner a little bit higher on the layout. Now I'm going to start adding those leaves to each of the clusters. I do think that leaves help the clusters come together, although I will continue to make little micro changes in the position of the flowers and the leaves and everything in the clusters until I'm happy with the way that they look. Oftentimes with the die cuts, I won't use the entire thing. Sometimes they're a little bit too big to fit in the spot where I need them, so I always feel free to trim those die cuts down and combine them, whatever is necessary to have those leaves fit into the space where I want to put them. I feel like the clusters have come together, so I am going to start attaching everything down. I removed those sentiments. I just felt that they didn't really add too much and made the layout look a little bit too crowded. Here I'm using my ATG gun and I'm attaching the leaves down. And then after I had all the leaves attached down, I got out my heavy matte gel medium. Once again, I use Liquitex brand, and I'm using an old paintbrush, and I'm putting a good generous amount on the back of each flower to attach those down to the page. You can see that as usual, I'm continuing to rearrange the flowers as I'm attaching them down. After I put all of the flowers in place with the gel medium on the back, I noticed that some of them were popping up a little bit. So I looked for some heavy things on my desk, placed them on top of the flowers, and that helped them to adhere to the background. I added some touches of green to the photo corners using some enamel dots. Now I'm using Finnabair heavy white gesso and an old bristle brush. I am dipping the brush into the gesso and just dabbing it very lightly on the edges of the flowers. You could really see the effect that this has on the dark blue flowers. I really like the way the white looks on the flowers. I think that these highlights add a lot to the look of the clusters. The photo that I'm using is an old one, or fairly old. I took this photo in 2015 when my family went on a weekend getaway to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I go there every year for the Creating Keepsakes convention in July, and when the kids were little, we used to make a whole weekend out of it. We had just arrived at our hotel. It was late at night, and the kids were excited to swim in the pool. I always found when they were little, we would plan these elaborate vacations, or somewhat elaborate anyway, and they really were only interested in swimming in the pool. And when I say it was late at night, it was probably about 9 o'clock, 9:30, but we always found that most pools were closed that late, and the kids were just, I remember, thrilled that they were able to go for a swim before we went to bed. I love these little laser cut bows that were included in this month's kit. I think I used all of them up. I included one on the bottom arrow. I still had the green enamel dots that I used on the photo corners out, and I was thinking that smaller enamel dots would look a little better, so I made that switch. Now I'm going to add some die cuts to each of the floral clusters. I'm using another die that's made by Sentimentally Yours. This is called Berry Branches. I suppose that if you cut it out of different colors, it could look like little holly berries, but when I cut it out in white, I think it looks like little buds, and I think this just adds a nice delicate touch and introduces a little bit of white and brightness into each of the clusters. And I always feel that the clusters look incomplete until I've added these little die cuts to them. Just like with the leaves, I will definitely trim these die cuts down and make them a little bit shorter so that they'll fit in the space where I want to put them. This particular die is great for cutting into sections because you can use the top, then you can use the bottom part of the die cut and get a lot of use out of die cutting. Die cutting can take a really long time when you're making a lot of die cuts, so I don't want to waste anything. Once I have all of these die cuts cut to size and tucked into the clusters, I use some gel glue and I attach those down to the page. I don't use a whole lot of glue. I just add a touch of glue that I add to the base of each of the die cuts. Every once in a while, I will miss gluing one down, and then when I go to take pictures or I move my layout around, they go flying off. So I'm trying to be really careful to get every single one of these little die cuts glued down to the layout. Now everything's glued down to the layout. This layout is complete, and here are some close-ups. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed watching it. I want to say thank you to all of you who watch my videos, subscribe to my channel, leave me comments. All of this has made my experience on YouTube wonderful, and I want to thank you for that. Please take a look in the description box where you'll find the link to the My Creative Scrapbook website where you can order a subscription. You could also check out all of their social media. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.